In the middle of the Pacific, under a blazing sun, sailors raised a mutiny against their own captain. It wasn't just about hunger and discipline, it was about freedom, and about the paradise that the Pacific Islands promised. But every paradise has its price, and this one would prove exceptionally high. Before you sail away like the rebels of the Bounty, leave a trace. Like this video, write in the comments where you're listening from, so I know I'm not conducting this broadcast alone on a raft in the middle of the ocean. Alright, let's begin. You stand on the shore of Pitcairn Island on the 5th of March, 1829, listening to the final words of a man who survived one of the most famous maritime tragedies in history. John Adams is dying at 61 years old. His face bears the characteristic scars of smallpox, and faded tattoos from his seafaring youth mark his arms. His entire body shows traces of the lash, souvenirs of the Royal Navy's harsh discipline. In his hands rests a Bible in a worn leather binding, the only book that survived from HMS Bounty. From it he taught the children who now surround him to read. Though he himself had limited education as a common sailor, he made this book the foundation of education on the island. Adams is the last witness to events that began on a winter's day in Portsmouth and ended in tragedy on a small island in the middle of the Pacific. But the events that led to this drama began a century and a half earlier, when a young sailor, hiding his true identity, stepped aboard a ship. On the 26th of May, 1787, at the Blades shipyard in Hull, Yorkshire, you watch as the Royal Navy purchases the coal hauler Bethia for £1,950, built 3 years earlier. It's a considerable sum for those times. The Admiralty has a special mission for this vessel. Bethia will be converted into His Majesty's ship and receive a new name. She's to sail to the other end of the world for breadfruit sapling from Tahiti in the Pacific. Sir Joseph Banks, the renowned naturalist who accompanied Captain James Cook on his first voyage, convinced the Royal Society to finance this botanical expedition. The breadfruit tree is meant to become cheap food for slaves on sugar plantations in the West Indies. Lieutenant William Bligh, then 33 years old, is appointed commander. He's a veteran of Captain Cook's third voyage, where he served as navigator on the sloop Resolution from 1776 to 1780. Bligh is known as an excellent navigator, but also as a man of unpredictable temperament, with a tendency to publicly humiliate his subordinates. Initially, he has a reputation as strict but fair. Since Bounty holds the rank of merely an armed vessel, not a ship of the line, there's no marine detachment aboard to support the captain's authority. This seemingly minor difference will prove tragically consequential. As contemporaries noted, even Captain Cook always insisted on at least a dozen marines. Without them, Bligh must rely solely on officer loyalty and his own authority. The crew numbers 46, including botanist David Nelson and his assistant William Brown, responsible for the future saplings. Among the sailors is 20-year-old John Adams, operating under the pseudonym Alexander Smith after an earlier desertion. He's not the only crew member hiding his past. The Royal Navy often accepted men of questionable backgrounds as long as they were capable seamen. Particular attention falls on Fletcher Christian, a 23-year-old master's mate from a wealthy family in Cockermouth, northern England. Bligh knows him from earlier merchant voyages to the Caribbean and holds him in affection. Christian is considered a gentleman and a brave man. Witnesses to later events emphasised that everyone on Bounty was ready to follow him into fire. His education surpasses most of the crew, and Bligh quickly recognises and appreciates his natural leadership abilities. The crew composition is diverse, from well-educated gentlemen like Christian and midshipman Peter Haywood to simple sailors like Adams and Matthew Quintal. Aboard are also specialists, boatswain's mates, gunners, ship's carpenters, and even a musician, the half-blind harpist Michael Byrne. Each has his own story and reasons for being on this ship. On the 23rd of December 1787, Bounty sails from Portsmouth toward the Atlantic. The plan calls for rounding Cape Horn and entering the Pacific, but nature has prepared a harsh trial for the crew. The ship departs in the dead of winter, which doesn't bode well for such a long voyage, but delays in preparation left the Admiralty no choice. In January of the following year, Bounty stops at Tenerife to replenish fresh food and water supplies. You hear the conversations of sailors enjoying a brief respite on land after a month at sea. This is the last moment of comfort before the real challenge. Spanish governors treat British mariners with reserve, but trade must continue despite political tensions in Europe. But the hardest trial awaits in the waters around Cape Horn. From late March, Bounty attempts to force one of the most dangerous points on the world map. You feel the ship tossing on icy waves tall as buildings, hear the howling of Antarctic wind in the rigging. For 30 days the ship battles the elements until Bligh makes a decision. He turns back and chooses the longer route via the Cape of Good Hope. It's a sensible choice, but humiliating for an experienced navigator. The mission will be lengthened, and costs for the Admiralty will rise significantly. Bligh becomes increasingly irritable and critical of the crew. His comments take on a sharper tone. The failure at the Horn strikes hard at his pride. This is the first sign that the expedition won't be as simple as planned. For the first time, tension appears between the captain and Fletcher Christian, when Bligh publicly scolds the young officer for a minor negligence during watch. The waves around the Horn reach 20 metres, and winds achieve speeds over 100 kilometres per hour. Temperature drops below zero, the deck becomes covered with ice, and rigging freezes in chunks of frozen salt. Sailors work in such conditions, risking their lives with every climb up the masts. Some get frostbite, others faint from exhaustion and lack of sleep. In May, Bounty reaches Cape Town in the Cape Colony. During a month-long stop in the South African Dutch port, the ship undergoes repairs and replenishes supplies. Here you first see a serious crack in relations between Bligh and his former protégé. Christian begins questioning some of the captain's decisions, though he still tries to maintain the appearance of respect. The Dutch governor of Cape Town treats British sailors with cautious hospitality. European politics reaches even to the tip of Africa. The city pulses with life. It's a transit point for all journeys to the Far East. For the first time in months, sailors can wash in hot water, sleep in real beds, and drink fresh beer. In summer, Bounty stops at Adventure Bay in Tasmania, then known as Van Diemen's Land. Bligh collects plant specimens and allows the crew to rest before the final leg of the journey. Local Aborigines observe the white men from a distance, making no attempts at contact. This is the first encounter with Pacific indigenous peoples, whose lives flow to a completely different rhythm than in Europe. After 10 months of exhausting voyage, on the 26th of October, Bounty enters Matavai Bay in Tahiti. The first sight of the island takes your breath away. Emerald mountains rise from turquoise ocean, waterfalls cascade from vertical cliffs, and warm wind carries the scent of gardenia, frangipani, and hibiscus. This is a true tropical paradise, unlike anything any of the sailors had seen before. Contact with civilization after so many months at sea feels like rebirth. Tahiti was discovered by Europeans only 21 years earlier by Captain Samuel Wallis on HMS Dolphin. For the Tahitians, whose ancestors arrived here centuries ago from distant Polynesian islands, contact with white men was still relatively new. They received the crew with traditional Polynesian hospitality and curiosity. Queen Piraea personally welcomed Bligh, offering him the highest honours according to local customs. Bligh established a shore camp at Point Venus, named by Captain Cook during observations of Venus's transit in 1769. Officially, the sailors were to guard future breadfruit saplings, which could only be taken at the proper moment in the vegetation cycle. In practice, this meant 5 months of life on land in tropical climate, a mistake that would cost Bligh everything. The sailors quickly adapted to life without strict naval discipline. They slept in huts of bamboo and palm leaves, ate fresh mango, bananas, breadfruit and coconuts, drank coconut milk straight from the shell. Tahitian women taught them dances and language. A unique dialect emerged combining 18th century English with Tahitian, the embryo of the later Pitcairn language. Sailors donned clothing made from tapa bark cloth, participated in local ceremonies, and absorbed Polynesian customs. Fletcher Christian formed a particularly close relationship with a young 18-year-old Tahitian woman named Mutiny, also called Isabella. This intelligent and beautiful woman from an aristocratic family taught him the language and customs. Christian already wore Tahitian garments and participated in rituals, and his transformation from European gentleman to adopted tribal chief's son was profound and visible. Tahitian society had a clear hierarchy: Ari, aristocracy; Ratira, minor nobility; and Manahun, common people. Europeans were treated like Ari of the highest rank, which greatly flattered simple sailors who stood at the bottom of society's ladder in England. Bligh tolerated this situation but introduced mandatory exercises for the crew. His shrill voice rang out with orders for dancing on deck, meant to prevent scurvy and maintain fitness. When Gardener William Brown and Gunner John Mills showed reluctance for this entertainment, Bligh punished them by removing their daily grog ration. This was the first signal of growing resistance to discipline. Sailors learned from Tahitians how to spear fish, climb palms, and dance. In turn, locals were fascinated by European tools, especially metal. A lively barter trade developed: nails for fruit, cloth for local goods. On the 4th of January of the following year, an incident occurred that shook the entire crew. Charles Churchill, John Millward, and William Musprat attempted to escape in a small boat, taking weapons and provisions. They wanted to stay in Tahiti, marry local women, and start families. This was the first open act of insubordination, showing how much discipline had relaxed. Bligh, with support from local chiefs, organised a pursuit. After 2 weeks, the escapees were captured and brought back in woven Tahitian shackles. Initially, they were helped to hide, but ultimately loyalty to Bligh prevailed. The captain ordered public flogging, rarely seen even in the Royal Navy. Millward and Musprat received 24 lashes of the cat-o'-nine-tails each, Churchill 12. The execution took place before the entire island community, which intensified the humiliation. The whistle of straps cutting through air, the crack of blows on backs, cries of pain, and weeping of Tahitian women created a dramatic spectacle. For Polynesians, who rarely used corporal punishment, this was incomprehensible brutality. Adams also fell victim to the captain's severity. He was accused of failing to watch a steering element, a metal rudder that a clever Tahitian diver had unscrewed and hidden as a joke. Bligh blamed Adams. The punishment, 12 lashes, was administered publicly in the presence of Tahitians. Women offered their own bodies in exchange for the young sailor's release, crying and begging for mercy. Some threw themselves on their knees before Bligh. This moved Adams for the rest of his life. Tension built like steam in a boiler. Bligh increasingly shouted at the crew, accusing them of laziness, theft, and lack of loyalty. He particularly humiliated Fletcher Christian, calling him a treacherous dog, scoundrel, and thief for allegedly stealing coconuts from the captain's stores. Public insults cut Christian deeper than flogging. As a gentleman from a good family raised in the cult of honour, he found them unbearable. Other incidents deepened the crisis. Bligh accused sailors of stealing cheese and wine, introduced reduced rations. Among the crew, whispers began circulating that the captain had gone mad from sun and power. Some openly said that life in Tahiti was better than service on the ship. By late March, the botanical mission was completed. Over 1,000 breadfruit saplings were aboard Bounty in special wooden pots, carefully tended by David Nelson and William Brown. The great cabin resembled a greenhouse. The technical success was complete. On the 4th of April, Bounty left Tahiti, setting course for Endeavour Strait and onward to the Caribbean. Bligh noted in his log that the expedition was proceeding according to the most optimistic expectations. The crew, however, had a completely different opinion about the prospect of a months-long voyage across the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. Departing from the paradisiacal island, many sailors turned their heads for one last look at shores that had become their second home. On the beach, women wept and waved scarves. Some were already pregnant by the sailors, knowing they would probably never see the fathers of their children. No one yet suspected that in 3 weeks something would happen that would change the fate of everyone aboard. After 5 months of paradisiacal life, the crew reluctantly returns to harsh maritime discipline. Before them lies a months-long voyage across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and onward across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. Bligh, concerned about the expedition's delays and rising costs for the Admiralty, becomes even more severe and critical than before the Tahitian stay. He knows that in London he'll have to explain the budget and schedule overruns. Tension aboard grows daily. In just 3 weeks since departure, the atmosphere becomes stifling and unbearable. Sailors perform orders with forced eagerness, avoid the captain's gaze, and whisper in corners during watch changes. Everyone feels that something must finally snap. The question is only when and how. Bligh introduces an even harsher regime. He criticises the crew for the smallest infractions, accuses them of laziness and lack of respect for royal service. His favourite tactic becomes public humiliation of officers before common sailors, which destroys their authority and undermines morale. This violates basic principles of command that every experienced officer should know. Daily exercises, once tolerated, now proceed reluctantly. Sailors dance on deck like automatons, without the joy they showed in Tahiti. Bligh shouts at them that they're lazy and ungrateful, comparing them unfavourably to Tahitian savages, who according to him had more respect. On the 27th of April, during morning inspection of stores, an incident occurs that overflows the cup of bitterness. Bligh discovers missing coconuts from his private supplies and immediately accuses Christian of theft without conducting an investigation. This public humiliation becomes the culmination of months of mounting tensions. Christian, already called a treacherous dog and scoundrel, now stands before the entire crew, wounded in his very core, in a gentleman's honour. You observe this dramatic confrontation on deck. Christian tries to defend himself, explaining that coconuts might have been used in the galley or given to sick sailors, but Bligh won't let him finish. In his eyes appears a gleam that's no longer just anger. It's something deeper and more dangerous. That night in the mess, whispers resound. Some speak of turning back to Tahiti against orders. Others utter the word for the gravest crime in the Royal Navy: mutiny. Fletcher Christian moves about the deck like a shadow, his face twisted with anger and desperation. Some sailors avoid his gaze, others silently await developments. According to John Adams' later account, recorded by Captain Bligh, that night Christian considered jumping overboard and suicide. He was in a state of extreme desperation, tired of constant quarrels and humiliations. Only the thought of sailors who trusted him and counted on his leadership stopped him. Thomas Burkitt and John Sumner approach him with a proposal to solve the problem. Matthew Quintal and Isaac Martin nod silently. William McCoy, known for brutality, speaks bluntly about the need to straighten out the situation. Christian hesitates but gradually gets drawn into the conspiracy. This isn't a coldly calculated plan, rather a desperate reaction to unbearable pressure. Just before dawn on the 28th of April 1789, everything changes. Bounty rocks gently on calm waters near the Tonga archipelago, then called the Friendly Islands. The calm is deceptive. On the horizon, there's no other ship. They're alone on the boundless ocean. You hear muffled voices and the rustle of bare feet on deck. This sounds different from the usual watch change at 4 a.m. You look through the hatch of your hammock and spot silhouettes moving with weapons in hand. Muskets, pistols, and cutlasses gleam in the first rays of sun. There are about 10 of them. They move quietly but decisively. Fletcher Christian, recently contemplating suicide, now leads a desperate mutiny against the captain's tyranny. As Bligh will later write in his report to the Admiralty, "Just before sunrise, Mr. Christian, along with the boatswain and several armed men, burst into my cabin while I slept. They dragged me from my cot, bound my hands behind my back, and threatened immediate death if I cried out. The mutineers act quickly and decisively. This isn't a spontaneous outburst of anger, but a carefully planned action." Bligh managed to raise the alarm, his cry echoing throughout the ship, but it was too late. Thomas Burkitt overpowered Master John Fryer, who tried to intervene. John Sumner aims a pistol at midshipmen who run from their cots in their underwear. You rush on deck and see a scene that will change the fate of everyone on Bounty. Christian stands with a cutlass in hand, surrounded by a group of armed sailors. Burkitt holds a musket with bayonet. Sumner waves a pistol. Matthew Quintal and Isaac Martin grip cutlasses. Their faces are determined, but you can see fear. They know they're committing an act punishable by the gallows. Captain William Bligh stands before them in only his nightshirt. His hands are bound so tightly that rope cuts into skin, blood seeping through. His face shows shock and terror. He can't believe his former protégé is leading a mutiny against him. He tries to speak to Christian, appeal to their shared past, but the young officer doesn't respond. Chaos reigns on deck. Part of the crew supports the mutiny, dreaming of return to paradise. Part remains loyal to the captain. Others are too terrified to take any position. Master John Fryer is quickly overpowered. Midshipmen Peter Hayward and George Stewart stand uncertainly, unsure which side to support. Boatswain William Cole, under threat of death, lowers the ship's largest launch, a 7-metre boat usually used for transport from shore. Now it must carry 19 men across thousands of kilometres of ocean. Cole protests, claiming the boat isn't suitable for such a voyage, but the gun barrel aimed at him silences objections. This is essentially a death sentence. The boat's sides rise barely 15 centimetres above water when loaded. There's no deck protecting against waves, supplies are minimal. everyone knows survival chances are minimal. Bligh and 18 men loyal to him are forced into this uncertain vessel. The captain begs for basic supplies. Christian, in one of his few gestures of humanity, allows them to take hardtack, a water barrel, some bottles of rum and wine, a few tools and basic navigation instruments, compass, quadrant and sextant. He refuses, however, to release charts and logs. Throwing the sextant to Bligh, Christian speaks words that will pass into history. "There, Captain, that's enough for you." Bligh will have to navigate thousands of miles without charts, relying solely on his knowledge and experience. Just before cutting the line, an exchange occurs between them. Accounts vary. Some claim Bligh asked about the reason for mutiny, others that Christian spoke of ending tyranny. No one knows the exact words. Around 8 in the morning, on the 28th of April 1789, the line is cut. 19 men in an overcrowded launch drift onto the boundless Pacific. 25 sailors remain on Bounty under Fletcher Christian's new command. You watch as the tiny boat disappears in morning mist. From this moment, you are mutineers, men without homeland and without future. Everyone knows that if the Royal Navy catches them, court-martial and the gallows await. But now they think only of one thing: what to do with the ship and the freedom they've just seized. William Bligh, sitting in the overcrowded launch with 18 companions, makes one of the boldest decisions in sailing history. Instead of seeking shelter on the nearest islands, where confrontation with natives threatens, he decides to sail directly to the Dutch colony of Timor, over 6,700 kilometres away. The first landing attempt on Tafua Island in the Tonga archipelago ends in tragedy. The natives, initially friendly, become hostile seeing the castaways' defencelessness. During the clash, Quartermaster John Norton dies, stoned on the beach while defending the launch. The rest barely escape with their lives. This incident convinces Bligh that further landing attempts could end in massacre of the entire group. One of history's most heroic voyages begins. In a tiny, overloaded boat whose sides rise barely 15 centimetres above water, 19 men sail across the boundless ocean. For 47 days they cover over 6,700 kilometres. Bligh introduces iron survival rules. Each receives minimal rations, about 50 grams of hardtack daily, and a spoonful of water every few hours. He forbids talk of food, which would only increase hunger. In the face of storms, cold and blazing sun, he keeps the crew disciplined. On the 28th of May, they reach the first reefs off northern New Holland, today's Australia. On a small island named by Bligh Restoration Island, they find shellfish, palm fruits and fresh water. These supplies allow them to survive the coming weeks. On the 14th of June, half dead from hunger and exhaustion, they reach the Dutch fort at Kupang on Timor. Of 19 men, only John Norton, killed at Tofua, didn't return. Bligh accomplished the impossible. He led the launch across the ocean without charts and almost without instruments, relying solely on his own skills. This is one of history's greatest navigational feats. Meanwhile, in England, the Admiralty doesn't yet know of Bounty's tragedy. Bligh returns to his homeland in March of the following year as a hero, though his glory will quickly be overshadowed by controversies. Upon arriving in England, Bligh faces court-martial, standard procedure after losing a ship. In October, he's acquitted, and in November promoted to captain, proving the Admiralty's confidence. However, his reputation becomes tarnished by the mutineers' trials, who accuse him of tyranny. Paradoxically, Bligh receives the nickname Bounty Bastard, which haunts him to life's end. Though he used flogging less frequently than other captains, his problem was verbal abuse and tendency toward violent, insulting gestures. As one historian wrote, Choleric vanity was his curse throughout life. In August of the following year, the Admiralty gives him a second chance. This time he commands 2 ships, HMS Providence and HMS Assistance. The second breadfruit expedition proves successful. Bligh delivers saplings to the Caribbean and also brings ackee fruit from Jamaica, which he presents to the Royal Society. But crew problems don't end. 6 years later, commanding HMS Director, Bligh gets caught up in the General Fleet Mutiny at Nore. Though this wasn't a personal mutiny against him, once again he found himself at a crisis centre. That same year he participates in the Battle of Camperdown, fighting the Dutch fleet. Lord Nelson praises his courage, though Bligh once again alienates officers with his arrogance. But enough about him. Let's return to our story. Already in November of that same year, HMS Pandora departs Portsmouth under Captain Edward Edwards' command, with orders to capture Bounty's mutineers. The mutineers on Bounty faced a fundamental problem: where to sail. Return to England meant certain death on the gallows. Remaining on known shipping routes risked meeting a British warship. In late September, Fletcher Christian decided to try establishing a colony on Bligh Island, lying over 1,000 kilometres south of Tahiti. In early June, Bounty reaches Bligh. The island seems promising: fertile volcanic soil, fresh water from streams, and lush tropical vegetation. However, from the first day, locals treat arrivals as intruders. They remember earlier contacts with Europeans and know they rarely bring anything good. Initial clashes begin over food, space, and women. Christian gets wounded by a spear in the leg during an attempted settlement with local chiefs. Several sailors suffer injuries from stones and axes. At first, these are isolated skirmishes and misunderstandings, but the situation quickly escalates into open war. Gunfire and cries of the wounded echo across Blight's beaches. The mutineers have decisive advantage: muskets, pistols, and Bounty's 4 cannons against spears, slings, and stone axes. But the natives know the terrain and fight with determination to defend their land. During a great battle, hundreds of warriors attack provisional fortifications built from Bounty's timber. Massacre ensues. The British, with firearms, mercilessly repel attacks. The toll is tragic. About 60 Bligh inhabitants, including women, die in the clashes. This wasn't a fight between equals, but one-sided slaughter. This is the mutineers' first bloody stain, long before reaching Pitcairn. After several weeks of senseless fighting, Christian decides to abandon Bligh. Violence escalates not only in relations with natives, but within the crew itself, which quarrels over women and spoils. The place meant to become a new home turns into a battlefield. Bounty returns to Tahiti. There the mutineers must make a decision that will divide them forever and determine everyone's future. In Tahiti, a dispute erupts that divides the mutineers into 2 nearly equal groups. 16 sailors decide to stay on the island and risk meeting British justice. They hope to convince a court of their innocence, or at least minimal participation in the mutiny. Indeed, some took no active part in seizing Bounty. This group includes Peter Heywood, a mere 17-year-old midshipman from a good family, George Stewart, James Morrison, an experienced boatswain and chronicler of events, William Muspratt, Thomas Burkitt, John Millwood, Thomas Ellison, Michael Byrne, the half-blind ship's harpist, and also Joseph Coleman, the armourer, Charles Norman and Thomas Mackintosh, both ship's carpenters. There are also Charles Churchill and Matthew Thompson, former deserters, earlier caught and punished by Bligh. Not all in this group were voluntary mutineers. Young Heywood and Stewart will later claim they had no choice. Christian sailed away, leaving them in Tahiti. On the island, a tragic episode occurs that exposes the mutineers' moral decay. Charles Churchill, known for brutality, kills Matthew Thompson in a quarrel over a Tahitian woman. Soon he himself dies at the hands of Tahitian avengers. These are the first fatalities among mutineers, the result of internal feuds and native anger. Fletcher Christian, with 8 most determined and terrified men at the prospect of pursuit, decides on a desperate step. He resolves to seek asylum far from shipping routes. In late September, he assembles his group. John Adams, still using the false name Alexander Smith, Edward Young, William McCoy, Matthew Quintal, John Mills, William Brown, John Williams, and Isaac Martin. Christian also needs workers for building the new colony. He takes 6 Tahitian men as labourers and 11 women, including one with a small child. Some join voluntarily, lured by promises of better life. Others are deceived or even kidnapped. On the last evening in Tahiti, Christian organises a farewell feast on Bounty's deck. He invites local friends, his men's families, and potential colonists. When the atmosphere becomes relaxed, he suddenly orders the anchor line cut and pulls away from shore, kidnapping guests as hostages. Joseph Coleman, the experienced armourer whom Christian wanted to retain for his technical skills, figures out the deception at the last moment. He jumps overboard and swims to shore. Several older Tahitian women Christian deems unnecessary. He lands them on nearby Muria Island so they won't burden supplies or take up space. On the 23rd of September 1789, Bounty leaves Tahitian waters for the last time. Aboard are about 27 people, 9 Englishmen and 18 Polynesians, including one small child. Before them lies the boundless ocean and desperate hope of finding a place where they can live in peace. But peace will prove an illusion. Christian studies charts and books from the captain's library and finds an interesting mention of Pitcairn Island, discovered by British ship HMS Swallow under Captain Philip Carteret's command in 1767. According to records, it's an uninhabited rocky island with fertile soil and fresh water springs. Most importantly for the fugitives, Pitcairn's position on charts is incorrectly marked about 320 kilometres too far east. This results from errors in longitude calculations, common in the 18th century before accurate marine chronometers were invented. Christian understands these are ideal hiding conditions. Even if someone searches for them on this island, they'll end up in a completely different place. After 3 months sailing the open Pacific on the 15th of January 1790, the watch cries historic words, "Land ahead." Pitcairn proves to be a paradisiacal scrap of land about 4.5 square kilometres, rising 200 metres from the ocean. You see steep basalt shores protecting sea access, covered with lush tropical vegetation. The island's interior consists of fertile valleys with natural freshwater springs, wild growing coconut palms, bananas and other fruits. The island has been uninhabited for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. You find remains of ancient Polynesian settlements, stone foundations overgrown with jungle, traces of cultivation terraces on mountain slopes, old stone roads leading to abandoned Maori temples. This proves that people once lived here, but for some reason abandoned the island long before Europeans arrived. After several days of reconnaissance and unloading everything useful from the ship, tools, supplies, livestock and precious breadfruit saplings, Christian makes a symbolic and final decision. On the 23rd of January 1790, HMS Bounty is deliberately set afire and left to sink in a small bay off the island's northeastern shores. You watch flames consume the sails, masts and deck of the ship. that had been your only home and link to the world for the past 2 years. As will be noted in the island registers, on this day a ship of His Majesty was burned at Pitcairn. This is the first official entry in the chronicle you'll keep for the next decades. The smoke rising over the bay, which from this day will be called Bounty Bay, means you've burned all bridges behind you. You're condemned to this small island in the middle of the world's largest ocean. There's no longer a way back to the civilized world. In 1957, American explorer Lewis Marden, working for National Geographic, will find on this bay's bottom the steering pin, anchor, and last of Bounty's 4 cannons. But that will happen only in 167 years. Now you're completely alone. The first months on Pitcairn realize dreams of life in a lost paradise. You erect provisional shelters from leaves where Adamstown now stands. But you quickly begin building permanent houses from Bounty's salvaged timber, using sails as roof and wall covering. Sail canvas is cut into clothing, ropes used to build simple but functional structures. Among you is Tiora, an aristocratic Tahitian woman born around 1775, who will become the island's most important tapa weaver. This intelligent and talented woman becomes partner successively to Ned Young, Matthew Quintal, and finally Thursday October Christian Fletcher's son. Her tapa weaving skills, traditional material from tree bark, will be crucial for the colony's survival. In these bark cloths, Tahitian women will hide the island's true history, passing it to visiting ships as the only testimony of their experiences. The island abounds in natural riches needed for survival. Fresh water flows from mountain streams to small lakes. Coconut palms provide nuts, wild banana, breadfruit, plantain, and other fruits grow in abundance. You also discover plantations left by former inhabitants, taro, yam, sweet potato, and other roots, which you quickly restore to life under botanist William Brown's care. Land division creates tensions from the start. Only 9 Englishmen receive plots according to Bounty's hierarchy. Fletcher Christian as mutiny leader takes the largest and most fertile plot in the island's centre, where he builds a house in the place that begins being called Adamstown. 6 Tahitian men receive no land. They're to work like servants on white colonists' plantations. In October of that same year, the first child is born on the island, Thursday, October Christian, son of Fletcher and his Tahitian wife, Maimiti. The child's name commemorates the day of birth according to the English calendar. This joyful event gives hope for the small colony's future, but doesn't ease growing social tensions. Beneath this idle surface, deadly conflicts smoulder. The main problem is fundamentally unfair division of power, resources, and, most importantly, women. Tahitian men are treated more like slaves than companions in this enterprise, as one visitor will later note. 2 Polynesians are killed by another Tahitian man on direct orders from mutineers, further inflaming the situation. These are the first murders on the island, showing how far Europeans are willing to go to maintain control. An even more serious source of conflict is gender relations. 15 men live on the island, but only 11 women plus 1 girl. This mathematical inequality leads to constant conflicts. In 1790, 2 women die in accidents, further worsening the situation. Tahitian women passed from hand to hand like property, having virtually no influence over their fate. William McCoy and John Williams treat their Polynesian partners like objects that can be exchanged, abandoned, or transferred to others at will. Matthew Quintal, known for his quarrelsome character already aboard Bounty, becomes particularly brutal toward Tahitians. In 1797, the situation dramatically worsens when William McCoy, who previously worked in a distillery in Scotland, discovers how to distill strong alcohol from the roots of the tea plant Cordyline terminalis. Growing wild across the island, he creates poison that colonists call Tahitian rum. McCoy has a partner, Teo, with whom he has 2 children, son Daniel and daughter Catherine. But his greatest passion becomes alcohol, which he produces himself. Along with Matthew Quintal, he falls into heavy alcoholism, spending days in drunken stupor while women must care for children and run households. Drunk McCoy and Quintal become increasingly aggressive and dangerous. They beat both Polynesian men and women, including their own partners. Tiora, Quintal's partner, can't endure this violence. In 1799, she falls or throws herself from a cliff to her death. Some believe it was suicide from desperation. Under alcohol's influence, even the smallest disputes escalate into threats, fights, and demands for revenge. Tahitians, humiliated while sober, become even more aggressive and prone to desperate acts after drinking. Polynesian men begin plotting against their white oppressors. You hear them talking nights in their melodious language by fires away from the English part of the settlement, making meaningful gestures toward huts occupied by the British. They plan desperate revenge for years of humiliation and brutal treatment. Christian tries to maintain some order and social peace, but has no real power over men who increasingly see him as just another colleague, not a leader. His leadership during the mutiny resulted from the moment's desperation and anger at Bligh, not natural leadership abilities. On the island, he proves to be just one of 9 equal men. The drop that overflows the bitterness cup is the death of Tahitian woman with the long Polynesian name Tiehuta Tuonoa. This young wife of John Williams dies during difficult childbirth, leaving him alone. Williams, instead of mourning his loss, immediately demands compensation. He requires that Tahitian man Nihau give him his beloved partner as a replacement. Nihau categorically refuses. Williams responds with violence, publicly beating the Tahitian. This is definitely too much. At dawn, 4 remaining Tahitian men decide it's time for bloody revenge. Fletcher Christian is shot while working at a pond. He dies at only 29 years old, leaving his pregnant wife Maimiti. That same day, John Mills, William Brown, Isaac Martin and John Williams also die. McCoy and Quintal miraculously escape death, hiding in the mountains. John Adams is seriously wounded by a bullet in the neck but survives. By evening, the situation changes. Tahitians fight among themselves. One dies in a brawl, another is killed by a woman in revenge, the third dies at Quintal and McCoy's hands, and the fourth at Ned Young's hands. By day's end, of the 15 original men on the island, only 4 remain: John Adams, Edward Young, William McCoy, and Matthew Quintal. All Tahitian men are dead. 10 Tahitian women and several children remain. After the massacre, 4 years of relative peace follow, interrupted only by women's outbursts, as Edward Young records. Some try escaping by raft, but the ocean proves too dangerous. Young, the most educated, takes actual leadership and keeps a journal, describing house construction, fences, pig traps that multiplied and destroyed crops. Gradually, life returns to balance, but McCoy sinks into alcoholism. On the 20th of April, 1794, suffering from alcoholic delirium tremens, he ties a stone to his neck and throws himself from a cliff. He's 35 years old. After his death, Quintal becomes even more dangerous. He threatens to kill all of Christian's children. Young and Adams plan his death. In 1795, they kill him with an axe. He's 33. At the century's turn, Edward Young dies of asthma at about 38. Adams keeps vigil at his bedside with Bounty's Bible. From this moment, John Adams, the only survivor of 9 original mutineers, becomes patriarch of a small community consisting of 9 Tahitian women and 19 children. Before him lies one of humanity's most remarkable transformations. The story you've just heard doesn't end with John Adams' death. It's only the beginning of a much larger tale that continues today. In following years, Pitcairn became an object of interest and sympathy from sailors of various flags. Captain Frederick Beechey on HMS Blossom visited the island in December 1825, and for 2 weeks spoke with Adams and the young generation of Pitcairners. This was the first official contact with the civilized world since the mutineers' arrival on the island. Beechey created a detailed record of community life and recorded Adams' final memories, which became the basis for historical accounts of the Bounty Mutiny. The community of Bounty mutineers' descendants not only survived all tragedies, but flourished for the next 200 years. When in the mid-19th century Pitcairn became too small for the growing population, most inhabitants moved to Norfolk Island off Australia's coast, where they had more space and better living conditions. The Pitcairn language, which developed on the island as a mixture of 18th century English and Tahitian, survived to modern times. Mutineers' descendants speak in this unique dialect, which stands as a living monument to their extraordinary history. Thursday, October. Christian, Fletcher's son, lived to only 40 years old, dying in 1831, but became a respected leader of the new community. His descendants spread across the Pacific, carrying genes and memories of their famous ancestors. In the 21st century, only several dozen people live on Pitcairn, but 1,000 Norfolk Island inhabitants, half its population, can trace their ancestry to Fletcher Christian and 8 other British sailors who burned their bridges on the 23rd of January 1790. The mutiny on HMS Bounty remains one of history's most fascinating maritime rebellions, capturing imaginations for over 2 centuries. While popular culture has often romanticised the events, the reality was far more complex and brutal than Hollywood portrayals suggest. The expedition itself was part of Britain's broader colonial enterprise. The breadfruit mission aimed to provide cheap food for enslaved people in West Indian sugar plantations, connecting this dramatic story to the wider context of slavery and imperial exploitation. The mutineers' treatment of Tahitian companions, particularly the kidnapping and the inequality in their Pitcairn settlement, reflects the colonial attitudes of the era. Modern historical scholarship has nuanced our understanding of both Bligh and Christian. Bligh, while certainly harsh, was not unusually brutal by Royal Navy standards of the time. His real failing was psychological, his tendency toward public humiliation and verbal abuse. Christian, meanwhile, was not the noble romantic hero of popular fiction, but a young man driven to desperation who ultimately proved unable to control the violence that followed. The Pitcairn community's survival represents a remarkable case study in colonial settlement, cross-cultural interaction, and social evolution. The development of Pitcairn language, the integration of Polynesian and European customs, and the eventual establishment of a functioning society from chaos offers insights into human adaptability and cultural fusion. The story's enduring appeal lies in its fundamental questions about authority, freedom, and the price of paradise. It remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of tyranny, the complexity of justice, and the often violent collision between different worlds and value systems. Behind the romantic tale of sailors who chose freedom, however, lies a less fairy tale truth about betrayal, violence, and loneliness at the world's end. So how do you see it? Was this a fight for freedom, or rather a desperate escape into paradise's illusion? And remember, before you sail away yourself, leave a subscription, like the video, and hit that bell so you don't miss future stories.